one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, roll call. Looks like everyone here is present tonight. Thanks for everybody coming out tonight on this cold January night. So thanks for being here tonight. The approval of the agenda. Do you have any additions or deletions? I think we're all set on that. So the approval of the agenda. Okay, and then tonight, for our presentation tonight, we have our Land Preservation Conservation Board. And we appreciate them being here tonight to share a presentation with us at this time.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing the Land Preservation Board to come and make a presentation to you. I just want to introduce to you and to the people, the public, Steve Schaefer, he's the secretary of the board. Carl Bierman, Sandy Petrosky, over there, she's the representative from the Planning Commission. And then we have Mary Beth Schmidt, who's the liaison to our board, and we're happy to have her. Tonight we're just going to make the presentation, and we're not doing any motions after this or anything. We just want you to sit back and hopefully learn more about what this land preservation in Salem Township is what it is and what it can be, and kind of the history of where we've been and where we're going. And I hope that you will have questions afterwards. If anything sparks an interest with a question, please make a note of it and we'll go back, because we just want to get through the presentation and then we'd be glad to answer any of your questions. And we'll start with Steve.
Good evening. My name is Steve Schaefer. As Sue said, I'm the secretary of the Land Preservation Board. And tonight, just relax. We're just going to provide information. We're not asking for any money or any motion, so enjoy your food. First of all, we're going to begin with a bit of a preamble. This is kind of our mission statement. Land is an endowment of the nation. How we leave the land today impacts how generations will live tomorrow. Basically, the land is the one thing that we truly pass from one generation to the next. If we leave the next generation a quality place to live, they'll have a quality life. If we destroy the resources of the land, they'll suffer for it. So that's what we're here to talk about now. So before we get started, I'd like to give you a few things, something to think about. And I'd ask you to take a moment and think of the changes that you've seen during your life. Surely every one of us can think of a wooded place or a field or a meadow that's no longer there. It's become a subdivision, a shopping mall, and it'll never be returned. Just recently, I drove by 7 Mile in Hagerty, and I was shocked. It'd been a while since I'd been there. But I actually went to Schoolcraft College in the 80s, and that was a remote area. And I drove by where there was once a woods. There's not even a stump left in that area. And I didn't know where I was. I thought I made the wrong turn. But that can happen. It's still happening, even today, under the current economic conditions. I ask you to look around you, and look around this room. And every photo that you see, or nearly every photo that you see in this room, is a rural setting. It's a rural character. The very seal that you sit behind tonight is a rural setting. It shows a barn, a tree, and an open area. That's Salem. That's our township. It's the fabric and the core of who we are, and it's worth saving. Michigan was once known as the Great Lakes State, and we lost nearly 70% of our wetlands, or 11 million of our original acres of wetlands. Since 1920, Michigan has lost nearly 10 million acres of farmland. Michigan is going to become more and more of an important agricultural community or state in the future. The aquifers out west are drying up. And we all know what happened last summer with the heat wave. So water is going to become very important. Canton was once known as the sweet corn capital of the world. Today, Canton has become a densely populated urban area. I heard a comment from some people where they said that Canton at one time would never allow development beyond Beck Road. And that's changed. Once our communities to the east of us build out, they have to come our way. From 1982 to 1992, Michigan lost 854,000 acres of farmland at a rate of approximately 10 acres per hour. That's old data. It's probably over 1 million acres of farmland in this state. There are over 22,000 acres within our township. Most of what we enjoy as open space today is privately owned. Tonight, I ask you to think beyond your years. Think about the legacy that we're going to leave our children and the stewardship responsibility that we hold. Tonight we're going to go through several items. We're going to talk about the history and chronology of the Land Preservation Board. We're going to talk about reasons for land preservation. We're going to discuss the methods and tools for preserving. We're going to talk about what other townships are doing, take a snapshot of Salem, talk about building relationships with other groups, go over a summary of our last year's accomplishments, and then our next steps into 2013. The first item on our bullet point is in May of '09, the Board of Trustees appointed the Land Acquisition Committee. Our charge was to inventory the current land owned by the township and investigate whether additional land should be purchased for the future. In January of 2011, we made our first presentation to the board and laid out the land ownership and who owns what. There's approximately 30 acres of land in the entire township that is open for public use. That has not changed. That has not changed since 2011. Land Preservation and Conservation Ordinance was written in 2011 by the Rural Preservation Conservation Board and adopted that same day. The Rural Preservation and Conservation Committee became a Land Preservation and Conservation Board, the same as it is today, and the board approved the hiring of Barry Lonick, who is sitting right there. Barry's with Tremore Ecology and Land Services. He's been a tremendous asset to our organization and our group. And I want to go back a minute. We had to have an ordinance in order to go forward. And that was one of the big items that we had to pursue before we went on. Maybe you probably remember all of that. Salem Township Board approved $1 million for land acquisition or development rights allocated over 5 years from the interest income on investments not to exceed $200,000 annually. That was approved August 23rd, 2011. The Salem Township Board endorsed the expansion of the Ann Arbor Greenbelt approximately 3 square miles into Salem Township in September of 2011. I have here is a picture of Washtenaw County. Washtenaw County is probably one of the most progressive counties in the state when it comes to land preservation. Ann Arbor expanded their greenbelt into our township, which opened us an opportunity to go after more funds for the greenbelt. It gave us 3 more square miles of land that we could preserve or have an opportunity to preserve. The Land Preservation and Conservation Board had received, let's see, I missed one. The Land Preservation and Conservation Board hosted an open house for owners of 15 acres or more on October 26th of 2011. Since then, we received over 25 applications for land preservation over 1,200 acres in Salem Township. Those are people who voluntarily came to us and said, we're interested in your programs. 2 properties were submitted for grants to the Federal Farm and Ranch Protection Program, that's the FRPP. On March of 2012, federal funding was approved for both properties. We have been approved for over $330,000 to go after these lands for land preservation. The Board of Trustees approved a contribution to the purchase of development rights in the Ann Arbor Greenbelt on 73 acres on July 10th. This was our first land preservation with our board in this township. Salem contributed $64,200 of that in December of 2012. That was just recently closed. That is for the purchase of development rights. The Board of Trustees also approved funding to create Salem Township's Park and Recreation's Master Plan to qualify for Michigan Natural Resource Trust funds and open spaces. Our goal is to have that completed in 2013. The Michigan Natural Resource Trust Fund is a state fund where monies are taken from revenues of gas and oil taken off of state land. It's $30 million annually. We can go after that money. They will pay up to 75% of those interests if we make application. In order to do that, though, we have to have a Parks and Recreation's master plan. I made that presentation last year, and we are currently working on that, plan to get that done this year. Once that is completed, we can go after those monies. And those monies right now are being used, but they're being used in other counties and townships who have a master plan, one of which is Salem, and we'll talk about that in the future. So reasons Salem Township should preserve land. Preserving land is an investment in everyone's quality of life. The recent survey shows that residents support preserving the rural character of the township, and listed rural character as the #1 attribute for country atmosphere. And I have a copy of the survey that was done in 2011.
That's not confidential.
Protecting land lowers the demand of public service. So land that is set aside or rural does not require police, fire, or school. Protected land supports and preserves wildlife habitat for plant species and watershed protection. Preserved land and parks make existing properties more valuable. Properties around there will become more valuable because people who like open spaces will be attracted to it. Land prices are lower today. I don't know if I can say that. I know that agricultural land is coming up. Residential property is at historic lows. But this morning, I was looking on the internet. I read the Bloomberg report, and they said the 2013 outlook says we don't have enough houses in this country, which surprises me. But what they did say is that there is a need to build more homes, and that home prices are going up, which means we're probably going to see more development coming our way. There are numerous matching funds and grants available, and Barry's going to talk about that. Those are the partners that we're going to speak of tonight. There's a lot of areas that we can go after. Ann Arbor Greenbelt, Michigan Natural Resource Trust Fund, there's Washtenaw County Parks, there's a number of groups that we can go to who are willing to partner up with us. And with that, I'm going to let Barry come in and talk.
Thanks, Steve. Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you all for the first time, many of you. There are two ways that we can preserve lands to protect them from being further developed. The first one is to acquire title to the land. We actually own the land. And when you own the land, then you're responsible for insuring it, for developing it, if you're going to put in trails or any other kind of facilities, to maintain those properties, and then to defend them from trespass or other incursions that are on the property. So the one way you can secure land is to acquire it in fee title. The other way is to acquire the development rights to the property. And the development rights are those rights that a landowner owns right now to divide the property that he owns into smaller parcels, to build houses on those properties, to mine the surface if there are sand and gravel resources that are available there. If there's woods in the property, they can manage the woods or even clear cut the woods. Those are the development rights that one owns as a property owner and can convey to another entity. You can sever certain rights to the property while still maintaining ownership of the property. And we call those the development rights. We do that through a deed restriction that's called a conservation easement. That's how we then secure the development rights. Those are perpetual restrictions that are on a property. So whoever owns the property from there on, whether it's the person who conveyed the rights initially or somebody else sometime into the future, they still have to abide by that permanent deed restriction that's signed and recorded with the county register of deeds. There's a number of organizations and programs in the county that are financially supporting land preservation. Steve mentioned the Ann Arbor Greenbelt program. that does extend into a third of Salem Township, a total of 12 sections. And so that's a matching fund source for us. And they're just acquiring development rights on farm properties. They're not buying land out here. They just want to make sure that there's green space around Ann Arbor, and their voters taxed themselves back in 2003, 10 years ago, for 30 years to create a fund to be able to buy development rights. They also have contributed to the purchase of a couple of properties, not in Salem but elsewhere, within that green belt by Washtenaw County Parks that do have public access to them. So that's a matching fund source for us here in Salem. Washtenaw County Parks has two programs. One of them is called the Natural Area Preservation Program that's been around for a dozen years now. And that one buys land and makes it accessible to the public. There's not any of those properties here in Salem yet. There are several in Superior that folks may know. There's a Kosh Headwaters Preserve I know of, and I'm blanking on the other one right now, but there's a couple in Superior Township, and there's other ones scattered around the county as well. I think there's 23 of those nature preserves around Washtenaw County. So that's a source of matching funds for us here in Salem as well. And then there's also, as of this couple of years ago, a farmland preservation program within Washtenaw County Parks as well. Both of those are funded by a $250,000 property tax that everybody pays. I pay it in Dexter Township, you folks pay it here in Salem. And those monies are then available for high quality farmland parcels or for natural area parcels anywhere in the county. And one of the things that we're doing is finding good parcels here in Salem and passing them on to those folks and saying, here's some good properties that you folks ought to go look at and contribute your funds to match our funds here in Salem. So those are ones that we can count on to bring money into the community. In addition, 3 other townships are running very similar programs to what we're doing here in Salem. Scioto, Ann Arbor, and Webster. They all have dedicated millages that their voters pass on 1 or 2 occasions now. I also staff those programs, so I'm operating 4 township level programs here in Washtenaw County. Steve mentioned the Federal Farm and Ranchland Protection Program, which is just to buy conservation easements or buy development rights on farm parcels. We have received a couple of awards from last year's grant cycle on that, and we're working through those projects now as we speak. Steve mentioned the trust fund also, which is for the state trust fund, which is for land purchases. So that is an opportunity for communities, whether it be townships or villages or cities or counties, to apply for funds from the state, which will supply them both to buy properties, but then also to help you develop the properties with playground equipment or picnic shelters or restrooms, whatever it might be. There's a couple of land conservancies, private nonprofit organizations that also operate throughout Washtenaw County, but certainly here in Salem Township. One of them is called the Legacy Land Conservancy. That's the organization that owns the 27-acre woods on the west side of Curtis Road, just north of Brookville, which is one of the 2 properties that's accessible to the public at this point. It's a 27-acre mature beech maple woods, beautiful place. And then the Southeast Michigan Land Conservancy, which is headquartered in Superior Township, they hold a conservation easement on a property at the northeast corner of Curtis and Joy, a little 40-acre piece there where the road curves. They have a conservation easement on that property. I'm going to skip ahead. Thank you. So we just want to spend a moment also just talking about why it's important to consider buying development rights, which is most of the projects that we're looking at here in Salem, as well as the vast majority of the projects that I've worked on in over 20 years of being involved in land conservation work here in Washtenaw County. One of them, the first one, is that it preserves farms here in Salem Township, the agricultural heritage, the landscapes, the contributions to the local economy that farmers make. It is the lowest cost option to preserve open spaces, and we wanted to use the Hornback property over on Brookville, east of Pontiac Trail, that the Ann Arbor Greenbelt closed on just about a month ago with that contribution from Salem Township's program. The appraised value for that property, this is what the Hornbacks actually bought the property, they bought it in 2012 and then applied to the Greenbelt program. They bought it for $540,000, so 73 acres, about $7,400 an acre. The development rights, according to an appraisal by an independent source, was $321,000. So it's less than buying the whole property. Of the $321,000, half of the money came from the Ann Arbor Greenbelt program. 20% came from Salem Township, 64,200. 20% came from Washtenaw County Parks through their natural areas program to preserve the woods and the wetlands that are on the property. And then the owners actually donated 10%. They took less than $321,000. They took $32,000 less than that. So they kind of contributed. So that was a four-way partnership on that property. And in the end, for something that was worth $7,400 an acre, if you were going to buy that, we were able to preserve that property with funds from Salem for less than $900 an acre. Steve mentioned how land where development rights are purchased have minimal demands for public services. The old saying on that is that cows don't go to school and cornfields don't call 911. Property where development rights are purchased remains on the tax rolls. And I want to indicate that we're opposed to buying land for public ownership and public use. But when you buy development rights on properties and those lands stay in private ownership, then somebody keeps paying taxes on that. They're paying for school taxes, they're paying their library taxes, they're paying for police and fire, whatever it is that they have to pay. The landowner who sells development rights is able to either expand their current operations or support their current operations. They might buy a new tractor, they might buy some additional land. We're working with some people who want to see their land be preserved forever, but they're also saying, you know, I'm ready to retire. And I'm happy to sell the development rights, but I also want to find somebody to buy this land who's going to farm it after me. And there are people who say, I can buy it at $3,000 an acre, the agricultural value for the property. They can't buy it at $6,000 or $7,000 or $8,000 an acre, the development value of it. We buy the development rights value of it. A younger farmer can go in then and afford to buy that land and start their agricultural operation. And that's happened a number of times in the area here in the last few years. It seems to be picking up a lot more of that. So it enables the landlord to sell the title at a reduced price to a young farmer. There are more matching fund sources to buy development rights than there is to buy the land outright, although there is some of both. And finally, the landowner is the one that's been responsible for maintaining the property, for posting it, making sure there's no trespassers, making sure that things don't happen on the property, and then not the responsibility of the township or some other entity to which the development rights have been granted. Thanks. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Barry. In order to gauge ourselves, figure out where we're at, we have to ask what other townships are doing. Webster Township has been very proactive, and they have over 3,300 acres of land preserved. Scioto, almost 2,000. Ann Arbor, 1,700. Pittsburgh, 1,400. Superior, 2,300. We have a map here of Washtenaw County. In fact, I'd like to, if I could get support, take a wall and make it our preservation board wall where we could hang this and up so everyone can see, because we've had a lot of people ask us about this. What's going on in Salem Township? Where can we find this? So if we had this hanging up, we could put information up so the public could see it. Be glad to share it. You can find this on the internet. It's all over. It's nothing secret. But as we get more land preserved in Salem, we'd like to color this in, right? It'd be a nice, something nice to see. So what does Salem look like? Here's a snapshot of Salem. And I broke this into two categories. And this comes back to one of the presentations we made a few years back. The top part is the land owned by the township as a whole. The largest, there's 260.27 acres that is owned by the township, the largest of which is the landfill, followed by the sewer treatment plant. There's Curtis Road, has 35 acres, which is currently in agricultural lease. And then the Veterans Park, which is this complex here, about 2.8 acres. Other preserve programs within the township, there are a total of 493 acres preserved in Salem Township using other programs. 27 acres, Barry talked about, is a creek shed preserve. We have the 73 acres, which was just added on the Hornbeck property off of Brookville Road. The Geiger property, which is 212 acres, Fishback 44, 42 acres at Curtis and Joy, and a Conant property. If you look at this picture here, this is a pie chart of Salem Township. These two slivers represent these numbers. There's 21,199 acres of private property within the township outside of this pie that are not preserved. Of all of that land, the only two parcels that are legally open for public access the 2.8 acres behind me, and the 27 acres off the Creek Shed Preserve. The rest of the land is either restricted or private land, not open for public access. So it's important for us to build relationships. There's an increased interest by other groups in land preservation in Salem Township, thanks to our board's work. We've actually gone out and talked to these people, opened up the door, and quite frankly, they said, you know, we've been waiting for Salem to come see us. And they're asking for input, they're asking for help, and they're actually very, very interested in being part of this. In the future, the Preservation Board will recommend dispersal of approved funds to complete surveys, environmental assessments, appraisals on the property. Before we can go forward and apply for these grants, we have to have an appraisal, we have to have surveys, and we have to be able to demonstrate that we know what we're talking about, what the true value of the land is. We have to come to you for that approval. Other agencies will provide funds for Salem's purchase of land and development rights. We have over $300,000 right now in the Federal Farm and Ranch program that's out there. We have other funds coming our way, hopefully. We will be expected to financially contribute to the purchase of land and development rights from Ann Arbor Greenbelt and county parks. They will be asking us to kick in. That's what that $1 million allocation was for. That's what that money is set aside for. Salem's financial participation is required to make land preservation possible. They will not support us unless we support them. So we will have to kick in. Key accomplishments for the Land Preservation Board. We completed mailing to different landowners with 15 acres or more. 23 landowners have replied, and we've had over 1,200 acres inquired on that people are interested in preserving their property. We've completed presentations on the Michigan Natural Resource Fund, Trust Fund. We received 100% approval from both boards on going forward on that to get to 75% of the money. We completed our first township purchase last year. We're very proud of that. The first step in a long way. It's our lowest cost option, is to purchase development rights. We did so at less than $900 an acre. Salem Township Preservation Board has identified 12 natural resource complexes, 6 of which are very high quality. One has been visited by the Washtenaw County Parks Natural Area, and it shows a lot of promise. If all goes well and all goes as planned, if this land goes forward, this will be open to the public. And it'll be one of the first properties that we will have in Salem Township where this millage that we pay into in 2010, which goes to all these other communities, will actually come home to Salem. Money that every one of us pays into. So there's a lot more to come. I really can't say a lot more about that. I don't want to jinx it. So looking ahead to 2013, the Land Preservation Board submitted properties for matching grants on 2 properties. Again, over $330,000. Negotiations are expected to be completed in 2013. The Balo family is selling the conservation easement on the county farm, on the Washtenaw County Farm Land Preservation Program. This will be done utilizing Federal Farm and Ranch funds. That will be another 215 acres in Salem Township Preserve. Farm ground. We're working towards the development of Salem Parks and Recreation Plan. I've already talked about that. The Michigan Natural Resource Trust Fund, we need help with that just to make this happen. Basically, in summary, we've come a long way since '09. We've changed the face of that map that represents our township. We hope to change it even further. We need to continue to build relationships with all the organizations we just discussed. There's a lot of money in Washtenaw County, and we need to go after that and help preserve what's here in Salem. The money has been allocated to preserve the land. That money's been set aside and being planned for. Looking ahead, we're going to be asking for your support. Our goal is to establish more lands open to the public. I want to make that 30 acres a lot larger. And Salem needs and wants preserved open spaces. We're looking at parks, trails for bikes, equestrian, and we need to protect our water. We need to protect our lakes and aquifers. So I hope this was informative. If nothing more, I got you to look at the pictures on the wall. And I hope that every time when you walk in to sit down, you remember that seal, remember what I mentioned today. Salem Township, where we came from, and who we are. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that a property remains on the tax rolls after the development rights are sold,
Yes, sir.
but is the tax the same? It seems to me it should be lower.
It's the same.
Should be higher.
Yes, sir.
If you own your part of it, and the person that buys the farm to refarm it loses it, what happens?
That's an easement that will go with the land. It's just like if,
So the banks agree with this?
yeah, they have to, right? That goes with it. It's just like if the power company was going through there, right? If the power company had a power line in there, that easement goes with the land. Yes, sir.
Yeah, good presentation. When you talk about acquiring the developmental rights on the property,
Yeah.
and now the landowner still owns that property, right? Okay, so it sounds like primarily it's targeted at farmers or farmland.
Yes.
It sounds, you know,
yeah,
like
federal
that's
farm
because
and ranch.
there's all kinds of money available. I can understand where they would want to do that, because you mentioned the one property, 300 and some thousand, that they got to preserve it, they paid 500 and some thousand, and yet they can still sell that property at a pretty substantial amount to somebody who wants to farm it. So now with those developmental rights, the township, the thing that wasn't explained is what is the rights of the township, or what is the goal of the township as far as the development of that land? Now, you talked about the landfill is one thing, farmland's another thing, but can different politicians come into office and have an idea that maybe they can cut some deals with some people and we can develop this land a certain way because we own the developmental rights? I mean,
No, we go ahead, Barry.
And the answer is no.
and why is that?
Because all they're doing is conveying certain rights to the property away. They still own all the other rights, including, you know, the ownership of the property.
Okay.
And so they control what happens on it.
When you say they,
The landowner.
controls, okay, he's giving away only certain rights.
And those rights are extinguished. They cease to exist. So it's not like the township or any other entity has the ability to exercise those rights. He gives those rights away and they disappear.
And which rights would it be?
The right to divide the property into smaller parcels, to build houses on the property. The key ones are that plus mining.
So you could still store anything you want on it?
No, you can't change it.
Usually what happens is,
You can't store stuff on it?
well, you
If
what
it's a
usually
far- if it's a
happens.
farm property, you can certainly continue to farm, and usually if there's a farmstead on it, then we identify that in the survey and say, you know, within that you can put up agricultural buildings, you can store equipment, you can do all kinds of stuff, whatever zoning allows you to do. But that's where, you know, the farm machinery and stuff has to remain. The farm land doesn't get developed from there.
So you can still
Usually
use
what
it for
will
about
happen
anything you
is
want.
a farmer will
Yes.
take a piece of land, let's say he had 80 acres, and he'll keep 10 acres out of that program. So let's say in the future he needs to build a barn, right? He can build a barn on that 10 acres, right? Or build another house in that 10 acres that's out of that. But the rest of the area has to remain, agriculture has to be preserved. He could park a tractor there overnight, no one's gonna say anything about that, right? But he can't build another barn on that preserved land. He can't let his kids build a house on the property. You know, that ground has to remain open and has to be preserved.
He can still farm that.
He can still farm it.
Okay.
The man can use the land. He can, you know, if a tree needs to be cut down, he can cut the tree down, he can plow, he can hunt, he can fish. It's his land, but he cannot develop that land.
Now, when he sells that land, what rights does the person purchasing that land have as far as development?
That, the same restrictions convey with the sale of the land.
Such as?
That the land must be preserved. So if you owned a piece of land and I bought it from you, right, and you signed up for a certain amount of agreements, you signed away your development rights, I have to adhere to those agreements, right? And it's spelled right out.
It's a deed restriction.
Pardon me? It's restricted.
It's a deed restriction.
So,
But I just was trying to get a clear picture
No.
of what are those restrictions?
you
No.
can't develop the land, in other words, you can't split it up and sell it.
Okay.
You can't build buildings on it, right?
So the
Can't put
topography of
ponds.
the land has to remain the same.
It has to remain the same, right? And I can't, like I said, give away an acre, let the kids build a house on it, and you have to preserve the land. You know, those are the easements.
Farming would, but most other things would not.
You can let trees grow,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, and a lot, you know, you can let it grow, you know. let the-
What about harvesting for trees? Could the person buy it, grow trees and harvest them?
That's right.
Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't see, you're gonna have to cut a tree eventually or clean it up, it's gonna fall down. That's sort of back.
When you purchase the development rights, what is the number of years that will last that contract? Is it forever?
Yes,
Forever?
yes, sir.
Can't be forever.
It's forever.
50 years is forever.
In the ordinance for the township, it says that 50 years into the future, a landowner can approach the township and say the land is no longer farmable. And the township can go through a process of evaluating whether that's a legitimate claim. But every party that has signed on to it, including if we have one of these federal farmland grants on it, has to agree as well. So 50 years you could ask, but doesn't mean that the answer is going to be yes. It's most likely going to be no. We consider it to be forever.
Where does the Stone School property fit into all this?
I'm not familiar with the Stone School.
I can answer that. That's owned by the historical Salem Area
Society, yeah.
Historical Society, and it's not reserved. It's a historical building and property. And, the Historical Society intends to maintain it as it is today, as long as we have the ability to do that.
And it's becoming historic, Michigan historic property. Site.
Well, we'll have it identified as a county historic property within, we're about 99% through that process. Then we go to Michigan, to the state of Michigan recognition, and then we would go for federal recognition.
Okay, well, it seems to me that that's kind of open for public use, so Steve, it
It's
seems like
open
you should
only-
know about that.
It's
It's right at the corner of Territorial and Curtis.
I know where it is. I didn't include it on this because
It's
it
open.
was,
At the courtesy of the Historical Society.
Also, that old Greek Revival Church over on Angle near 7 Mile is a state historic site.
it's open for public access.
I don't think so.
No.
But it's recognized by the state.
It's owned by the Salem
Unhistoric
Walker,
Greek Revival Church.
committee or board.
Okay,
The same
all right, how
way as
about
the
board
Historical
members?
Society
Let's
of
get some
West
comments from up here. Any questions? Want to start out? We'll start at this end down here, that end? All right.
Question, do you have a goal as to how many acres you would like to see preserved, and do other townships do the same? Do they have a goal about what % they would like?
We've never set a goal. We just struggled to get the first one, right? If you look at some of the areas in Webster Township, I'm not sure what percentage it was, but if you go back to our pie chart, they probably about 6 or 7 times greater of a section of the pie than what we're looking at currently in Salem Township. Yeah, I read an article one time where they said approximately 6 acres per person is considered a good rural landscape, but if you look at a city like New York, they've got Central Parks, 160 acres and 10 million people. I don't know, it's hard to say. You know, we haven't really sat down and said it's going to be 20,000 acres or 5,000 acres or even 100 acres. We fought just to get the first one. So.
The question, if a farmer decides to sell the development rights, and he has land that is underutilized, in other words, it's in trees, or it's in swamp, or it's in some other area, and you buy the development rights on it, and then he decides to go back in and clear cut it open up a gravel pit, do whatever else he wants to do. Where is the restrictions as to what he can do with that land? Other than, I mean, it's like clear cut. I mean, you were talking about a beautiful 40 acres that you have by you. And that would be great to have. But what if the farmer just decides to go clear cut it and sell the trees? What's to stop him?
In the conservation easement, it specifies what rights the landowner retains and the ones that they're giving away. And one of the ones that they're giving away, they're conveying, they're granting, is the right to clear cut the woods. They can manage the woods. They have to have a forest management plan produced by a registered forester. So they can go in and manage the woods on a long-term harvest basis, but they can't clear cut it. That's the main sort of right that they still retain. They can still farm the property. They can't drain wetlands. They can't mine for sand and gravel. That's all laid out in the conservation easement. Those are all prohibited actions, they're called. If somebody, so the responsibility of the grantee organization, whether that's the Salem Township or the City of Ann Arbor Greenbelt Program or Washtenaw County Parks or a land conservancy, whoever the grantee entity is, has standing in the conservation easement to defend what it says in there. So generally speaking, those grantee entities visit the property once a year. They call it the annual monitoring visit. And they send a letter ahead of time. It's not a surprise thing. And then give a call and say, hey, it's time for your annual visit. You know, I'd like to see you. You're welcome to walk around with me. What's a good day? They also do have standing in the easement to, if you called me on the phone and said, you know, something's going on over at Whitaker's property. I'm not sure if he's allowed to do that.
I know we've heard that phone call.
And it's in violation of the easement, then we can't enter the property, you know, at that point also. But generally speaking, we're going to go once a year and make sure that what was agreed to in the easement, you know, last year is being upheld, you know, sometime into the future. And there is legal standing for that grantee entity to proceed with court actions if necessary to rectify that. Now, if somebody goes out and clear cuts the woods that they're not supposed to, obviously you can't put the trees back on again. But there's a means of determining of what the penalty is for that. That's one of the few things in Michigan law where you can get triple the damages for trees that are cut inappropriately. But if somebody say, you know, I mean, one of the typical examples is we say no further houses are allowed on this property. And somebody says, well, I don't give a rip about that. I'm going to go build a house for my kid over there. We have the ability to go to court and say, no, you can't do that. The easement says you can't do that. And not only can you not do it, but then you have to restore the property to its previous condition.
Okay, good. One other question that I had with regards to the development rights and public access. I guess I'm kind of opinionated a little bit. If I'm using public funds to buy land, in essence, it should be used by public. I understand that it's open to the public one day a year. Is that something that is by law, or can you give me some kind of a feeling? Is that something that's negotiable with in the development right, or buying the development rights to have it open to public? I mean, like cross-country skiing, horseback riding, whatever. I mean, you can't expect a farmer to have come in and trample his crops. I understand that, but I'm really torn by having just give them, you know, not farm subsidized. I want to be able to use that land for the public's enjoyment, not just drive by and look at it.
Sure. The right to restrict access to one's property is a right that any landowner holds. And it is one that they can convey in a conservation easement. They can say, I'm willing to allow the public to come onto my property for certain activities. Most people, understandably, don't want to do that. And yet your point's well taken in that, you know, public funds are being contributed to the property. There's a bit of a shift there that's going on where, as you mentioned, in order to involve Washtenaw County money, either through farmland or for natural areas, there has to be some form of public access provided. And that's a negotiation between the landowner and, you know, if the county money's involved with the county. to find something that, you know, people feel reasonable with. I would argue that there's also other public benefits that come from the fact that that property is not going to be developed. You know, if there's wetlands and woods and so forth, there's wildlife habitat, there's water quality protection, and so forth. Those are public goods, hard to put a number on them, but they do exist out there. The other argument I would make there is that if a property, you know, instead of being protected, becomes developed, that there are houses that are put on it. And I'm not, and I don't think anybody on the Conservation Board is opposed to having development. We all live in houses. Recognize it's an important thing to have in our community, but so is natural areas and open space and farmland. And if the land is developed with houses, then public services have to be provided to those. You have to get schools and fire and police and all those kinds of things. And that ends up costing the community money also. And so I think about it as, you know, does the land be protected or does it get developed? And if we protect it, yeah, we might spend money on it, but it's always going to be there. It's always going to have wildlife habitat, and maybe it's a farm and it's producing, you know, food locally, certainly contributing to the local economy. And you know, if we let it be developed, then we got to pay for those services, and we have more traffic and so forth. So that's sort of the trade-off that I run through in my head. I'd like to have land be more accessible, but it's hard to do that with private ownership, which is why I think it's important also for us to buy or support the buying of properties that people actually can go to.
I think we need a mix of both. I mean, we can't buy all the land and own all the land in Salem Township. We can't preserve all the land in the township, but we need a mix of both, right? And I think by doing that, number one, it is the lowest cost option. It's very affordable to walk in and pay $800 and some an acre and have that reserved for time, right? And you know, people get to drive through that. They still get to see the deer run across the road. They still get to see and enjoy that atmosphere. They're still paying taxes. The township is not burdened with the responsibility of maintaining and building the property. It's a win-win deal, but we need a mix of both. And I personally don't feel 30 acres is enough for an entire township. We need more public access for land. I'm right there with you, all right? And in fact, we've looked at purchases of land in the township, and we can take you through that presentation if you want. But, you know, what it would take and what some of the snapshots would look at of some of the properties in the township. But we can't do all of one, and we can't do all the other. We've got to do a mixture of both, and that's kind of where our head's at. And I've said it all along since day one, we need to buy a piece of land that people can walk on, right? But Barry's taught me to come around a little bit and look at it the other way, because I was kind of where you were at initially. But I see the value. I see the value of both.
Thank you very much.
All right.
I wanted to clarify on the application process. You know, let's say I have a 100-acre farm, and you had talked about being able to split the usage. Could you explain that to me, make sure I'm understanding it correctly? If I have 100 acres and it qualifies and all this kind of stuff, can I say I want 70 of that to stay out of this development rights agreement and have 30 of it that I'm entering into an agreement with? How does that work?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So people apply to the program. We have a scoring system that the Board of Trustees approved, and I run it through that process, and I say, here's where this property scores and where it ranks with all the other properties that we've had nominated. And you know, it's got some good attributes. Maybe we can get a matching fund grant from these different sources. But then it's still a matter of working things out with the landowner to say, you know, they say, I'm really going to just do the 30, then this. Then if it's still worthwhile to do, we would do that, sure.
Okay.
And it is possible to, you know, leave out, you know, some acreage for a house sometime in the future, you know, for a child or farmhand or somebody else like that. So it's a negotiation back and forth until we can come to terms, you know, with a good project for everybody.
And the other question I have, one thing I don't like is the forever thing. I'm a woman, I love having options. And you know how that goes, you know, it just, I get nervous when I think of forever, because I think, you know, who are we doing this for? Obviously, our kids, our grandkids, future generations. Have we thought about, could this ever become a situation that this is not desired for whatever reason, that we need the flexibility to adapt and change? Is it possible to enter into, you know, has anyone ever talked about, in your experience, of doing this with a moratorium? You know, let's do it for 50 years, maybe at a reduced, you know, you're not going to get maybe as much money, but then it could be up for renewal again with both parties. Say, okay, you know, these are the people who are the current owners, the time has come for this to expire, and then it could be renewed. Does that ever happen?
There are some places that have done, they're called term easements. It's kind of like term life insurance, but it's term easements.
Sure.
For 20 years or 50 years or something of that sort. It's hard to calculate a value for those things because there is an end point.
Right.
And one of the reasons that we almost always work in perpetual easements, perpetual restrictions, is that there are a number of programs that require it. The Federal Farm and Ranch Land Protection Program being one of them. There's also a tax benefit for people like the Hornbacks who took less than what the appraised value was. They, in essence, donated 10%. They can write that off on their federal income taxes, but only the IRS will only recognize it if the easement is perpetual. So that's one of the incentives also. But it's certainly possible to do those kinds of things. It'd be harder to find matching funds for them and harder to put a dollar figure on them. But there is a program that's been going for a couple of years now in Leelanau County, which is run by their private land conservancy. It's a private nonprofit organization, like Legacy in Southeast Michigan here, and they just work on lands in Leelanau County. It's called Leelanau Land Conservancy. And I'll see if I can remember the name of the program right now, but they're doing that kind of thing. They're 10-year increments. People sign up for it. They get a payment each year for 10 years. And there's some other benefits to being enrolled in the program. It's all privately funded, you know, by donations. There's no government funds in that whatsoever. But we can certainly do that kind of thing here.
Why aren't there government funds? Is that because they won't partner with, or it just hasn't happened?
It's the government programs that are available want to have perpetual easements on property. So
on a federal level, you mean?
That's probably the only, well, and yeah, that's like the federal program is the only matching fund source for them.
Because that leads into my next thing. The federal government, anytime you take money from them, you know, I like to think that it's a consequence. What are the consequences of taking money from the federal government?
If we get money from this Farm and Ranch Land Protection Program to buy development rights on farmland, they do require us to insert a paragraph saying that they do have standing if the grantee entity, which could be Salem Township or, you know, somebody else, doesn't uphold their responsibility to monitor the property and make sure that house is not getting built, or the wetlands not being drained, or the woods is not being clear cut. If that responsibility has been abdicated, then they do have the standing to come in and enforce the easement. But that's the only other piece that they have. So it's only if whoever's responsible for monitoring and managing that easement is not doing their job, then they can stop it.
Okay, and the federal government can only enforce the agreement. They can't necessarily, can they come in and just take it? Or?
No.
Okay.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Supervisor. I've got 3 or 4 questions for the presenters, and thank you for coming tonight. Always appreciate the update, especially with our new board, getting familiar with the history and background of this new board. A couple of our neighboring communities, you mentioned in your presentation, do have local millages. What amount are they taxing themselves, and for how long? And since, Barry, you work with those groups, you know, I think one of the questions or comments was, you know, what is their long-term plan or vision for utilizing those monies, because some of them, like Webster, already has over 3,000 acres with, you know, if they're the same size as Salem, which I presume they are, close to it, you know, that's over, you know, 10% of their acreage is already preserved. And Superior Township too, with over 2,000 acres, is, you know, over 10% now of their land surface. So can you address that?
Yes, the three townships that have millages are Ann Arbor, Salem, and Webster. Ann Arbor Township had passed a 20-year millage 10 years ago. It's for 7/10 of a mill, and it generates about 200,000 a year, and actually a little bit more than that, 300,000 a year for Ann Arbor Township. SIO had a 10-year millage passed in 2004. It's for half a mill, and then it was renewed this past November for another 10 years. It wasn't quite expired yet, but that was the opportunity to go before the voters. And that generates about, right now, about $500,000 a year in SIO. Webster's had 2 5-year millages passed. We're in the midst of the second one of those two. I think that is, I think it's a quarter mil, but I'm not absolutely certain. I know it generates about $200,000 a year. So it's a similar amount to what the Salem program is available to it. Superior doesn't have its own millage, but the Southeast Michigan Land Conservancy has been very active there and has had support from the township, both financially, you know, from their general fund, but also there were a couple instances where the Conservancy identified a property and the township applied to the State Natural Resources Trust Fund. The Land Conservancy is not eligible for that, but the township was. They had their park plan, they submitted the property, they got it funded. So the Conservancy and the township worked together in that regard. Township-owned property on Cherry Hill Road. So they've done it a little bit differently than the three townships with millages have. So there's more than one way to skin the cat.
And as far as the millages for those respective communities, have they been strictly focused on acquiring development rights or conservation rights versus actual ownership of the property? Or are they doing a mix, as Mr. Schaefer alluded to, that maybe that's a strategy to employ?
The three townships with dedicated millages have primarily been buying development rights or contributing towards that, although there are a couple of cases in SIO where Washtenaw County Parks bought the property as a nature preserve, and the township contributed to their purchase of that, and sort of the Ann Arbor Greenbelt program. But the county parks are the ones that actually, you know, acquired title and, you know, put in a parking area and trails and so forth on the property, and they're charged with managing and maintaining.
The legend's all color-coded on.
And Steve, I appreciate you turning this so that the board can see it, because I was going to ask you if you could kind of highlight where the green belt is in Salem Township, and does...
Comes right through here. As Barry said, just approximately a third.
And that includes the new boundary lines, yes, for the expanded... And could you try to pinpoint where the new expanded area was captured?
Right through here.
Right there, the eastern part of that green belt.
This had a notch in it before.
They're east of Weed Road.
Yeah, Weed Road, basically. Went up to Weed Road. But we had a notch out of this corner, so we expanded it 3 square miles into Salem.
Well, Salem agreed to do the township border.
Yeah.
And the reason the Greenbelt even considered that was that Salem came up with some money, and they said, we want to reward them and do projects, you know, with them in an expanded area. So they added on those three sections.
So where's it at now?
It's 5 Mile, goes across 5 Mile, down to, does it go down Salem Road? Is that border road? Salem Road?
Weed Road is the
Weed
only
Road?
road that runs on that line.
Okay, so Weed Road, if it continues north to 5 Mile, That's where it goes, and then it takes that whole section from 5 Mile down to Joy. And then we drove over to Dick's Grove.
Purchase development rights inside, anywhere inside this group.
So it's like 33%.
And I would say all those townships, look for opportunities where some entity can acquire land and make it available to the public. But there's fewer opportunities for those things, frankly. I mean, most people don't want to sell their land, or their land isn't the type of land that would be suitable for that kind of a purchase. Some are.
One other question, then I'll have a closing comment, Mr. Supervisor, if I may. In regard to a past project that the prior board considered, and then it was turned down for lack of funding. I had spoken with our engineering consultants last month to see if there might be a renewed opportunity to talk to Ann Arbor Township and Northville Township about the proposed bike path along Pontiac Trail. With this new open parks committee that's being established, and with the opportunity to acquire land or grant monies through the state, is that the type of project that could get funded through that avenue? Looking down the road, and maybe you can't answer that, but I guess I'm just throwing it out there as something for other folks to brainstorm with me.
So to acquire easements along Pontiac Trail to allow for a bike route?
I don't know if it would be to acquire an easement, or if it would be a county right-of-way, or a county, but there's been talk about putting in a bike path along Pontiac Trail. And the first step was to do a feasibility study, and that got rejected. And then there was talk about trying to acquire grant monies to do that as well. And that's still in the discussion stages. But
we're in a little different situation in Salem in that there wasn't a ballot proposal before the voters that the voters said, yes, I'm willing to tax myself to do this. And in the ballot language, a statement about what funds could be used for. In the absence of that here, we've followed those kinds of leads, but without that specific charge from the voters, there's more flexibility there. Nevertheless, I would say that the funds that, I interpret the funds that the board has provided to date, the Board of Trustees, is for acquisition of land and easements. And if there was a project, to acquire additional easements, say, along Pontiac Trail, to facilitate the construction of a bike lane or a bike path along there, and I think that the funds available now could be used for the easement acquisitions, but not for the development.
I think you're asking about the Michigan Natural Resource Trust Fund, is that what you're, I think?
But that's certainly a potential source of revenue.
Yeah. In fact, if you go to the website, and they'll give examples of where some of the monies, it was used for making a boat ramp. It was used for making a target range. If you have a plan and can develop that plan, you can go after those funds, if it's open to the public use.
And that could be true for both the acquisition of easements and for the development of the facility.
I think it would fit what you're...
Yeah, I think it would dovetail nicely, perhaps.
Yes.
My last comment, Mr. Supervisor, is that I have been a proponent in the past of the township taking an aggressive look at investing some of its resources, since we've got 9 million of them, into property acquisition. Whether that's land acquisition or just outright purchase of property, that's something that I would hope that this Land Preservation Board could strategize going forward. We've committed as of last year to put $200,000 of investment money. We also have a couple $100,000 surplus that's looking to occur again this year and possibly next year as well, as we develop our budget for next year. And if we were to allocate a couple $1 million of our reserves, because we're hardly making any money on it while it sits in the bank, and maybe buying land is a smart way to invest it for the future, and gives the township the flexibility to not only preserve property but to sell it at potential profit down the road when it makes sense for the township to divest itself of certain assets. And so when you look at, you know, and this is just David Trent's perspective, if you look at the township putting $4 million of resources into land acquisition or the outright purchase of property, I think we need a strategy on where does it make sense to buy or acquire those properties and just not go at it like throwing a dart, so to speak, and say, well, wherever it lands, that's where we're going to go for it. And that's not to say that that's what the board has done up to this point in time, because you've been looking at properties where people haven't expressed an interest in the township acquiring those development rights. But I think going forward, as we've gone through this initial learning curve of, you know, what is it that we can do, how much interest is out there, that it would be good for the Preservation Board to discuss those strategies with the Township Board going forward, so that, you know, when we look at where is Salem going to be 10 years from now, that we've gotten the best bang for our buck.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody? Yes.
To further clarify how developmental rights affects your deed, it would be the same as your mineral rights. It used to be that when you bought a property, you owned the mineral rights. When you buy a property now, your deed specifically says you do not own the mineral rights. And that goes on forever because somebody else bought them from under your property. The developmental rights is a deed restriction, and it would follow the title of your land. When my daughter bought her property near Salem, she had a conservation easement because she's in the Salem River watershed, and she could build one house but no outbuildings. When she sells that house, the same easement goes with that property. It's a deed restriction.
Thank you.
Just made, and there has not been an upgrade to the software since that point. Our hardware technology, servers, laptops, computers, we've all progressed steadily over the years. Our software has not. It's not kind of kept up with the technology. Matter of fact, this current software is still on a DOS-based platform. And so all of our computers are Windows-based, and so it's just kind of causing some difficulties. And if you take a look on page 3, the upgrades, specifically assessing and taxation, it's important for our employees to be able to utilize that while they do their job, as well as the general ledger and accounts payable and all the regular things. So I would just ask that you would approve this. It is $17,635.
Mr. Supervisor, if I could add a comment for the benefit of the new board, that this was a planned expenditure for this fiscal year. We had budgeted $20,000 in our cost center for technology upgrades, particularly for this .NET program. When it was first conceived and developed a couple of years back, the county was the main proponent of encouraging jurisdictions within the county to acquire it, and it was a pretty hefty price tag when it was first put out on the table, upwards of $75,000. Obviously, a lot of the smaller communities balked at making that kind of purchase. The price has come down substantially since then, and I'd like to commend the efforts of our deputy clerk who spearheaded some tweaking of the original quote that the board had received, where the price was much higher, and we've winnowed it down to capture the main criteria that we need to invest in going forward. So this falls within our budgeted amount.
I'd like to also make a comment with regards to that, going to a lot of the Michigan Treasurers Association, or I should say the Treasurers Association, they, most of these townships are already utilizing this software as well as the county, and they all have glowing reports of it. And most recently, we've come across a question by one of our people that's on the utility building system and wants a special way. And we cannot answer those questions with the existing software yet. With the new software, we should be able to go back and give what they want. So it is, the existing software does have a lot of limitations where
Doesn't that require 3 bids?
It was a single source, Mr. Supervisor.
I have a question.
Okay.
How long do you think this stuff will last us? I mean, I know technology is constantly racing ahead and it can be really a nightmare to keep up with it. Do they provide service to us on, you know, it's like with Microsoft and all that, you get these updates when they become available and stuff like that. Do we have that kind of customer support?
Right, on page 6 of the ninth page, page 6 has the annual service upgrades and annual service fees, I should say. So those, each year, as BSNA makes their corrections and upgrades to theirs, it'll be passed on to us, so that's a good thing.
Anything else?
What's meant by single source?
Would you like me to answer that, Mr. Supervisor?
Go right ahead, Dave.
Single source is BSNA is our software, and BSNA is the only provider of that software, so we're acquiring it through them.
And we've had that on a consistent basis. Okay. All right, so we have a second?
Yes, David, so we're all set to vote? No, just...
Okay, all those in favor, let it be known by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passed. Okay, on down to, you got the sheriff's report in your packet, and also the Land Preservation Conservation Board had a packet for each of you. I don't know if any comments on our fire department tonight, Jim? You all said any comments? I know they've been working harder. The past storm here was crazy.
Yeah, I just want to say, our guys on Saturday night, we had a large wood chip fire that occurred because the wind was picking up fairly aggressively before this cold front came in. And then when the cold front arrived, and we were out the entire night until the morning, we responded to some 25 trees down across the township. All of our major roads were pretty much blocked, including Pontiac Trail at Brookville, 6 Mile, and 8 Mile. So with some assistance of the County Road Commission, which did show up fairly quickly once they got into notifications, we were one of the few townships that actually were able to open the roads back up. So I want to say thanks for our firefighters who spent the whole day and night out there cutting trees off the roads. So, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, just board discussion. People have been talking, or we have been talking, other people have been talking about going down to 1 meeting per month. I don't know if we want to discuss that here tonight. Something we can bring up at the next meeting to start in February, March, to go to 1 meeting per month, be the second Tuesday of each month. Keep in mind that, you know, we can, if there needs, something comes up of urgency, something that we can announce and have, you know, a special board meeting to post it and let people know if we do need a second meeting. But my feeling is that we should go down to 1 meeting per month and see how it works. if anybody else has any more comments about it, I just hear nods.
Well, I checked a few other townships in the area, and many of the other townships, even larger ones than us, only have one meeting a month, so there's some
I say
precedent.
one meeting a month, an hour and 15 minutes, no longer. So that'd be fine. All right, well, we can make that as a motion at our next meeting if we decide to go forward on that, or if any of you have any comments, feel free to talk to me afterwards, whatever. All right, any more public comment? That's where we're at now. And if not, we will go into closed session. Dale?
Mr. Supervisor, I move that Salem Township Board of Trustees go into a closed section pursuant to MCL 15.268 to discuss the pending litigation on the following legal matters with Attorney David Greco.
Okay, you have a second?
I'll second.
Okay. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Have a recess, short recess, and